I'm a bit hot in here. Feel free to take your jacket off.
Wow.
Andrew Denton, how should I have prepared for this interview?
I just talked over the top of you.
Yeah, no, we'll have to start it again for a clean feed.
Okay.
Andrew Denton.
The most damaging conversation we ever have is the one we have with ourselves. And sometimes you're not even aware you're having it.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Freedman, and you're listening to No Filter. Candid conversations that count. What do you really want to know? When preparing for any interview that he does, that's always the first question journalist, TV host and comedian Andrew Denton asks himself. What do you really want to know? Andrew has been interviewing celebrities and regular people for more than 20 years on radio and on TV. So when he came into the Mamma Mia offices for what would turn out to be our second chat on this podcast, actually, our first one was about the work that he does campaigning for euthanasia to be legalised. When he came in, I was a little bit apprehensive, to be honest. It's not that I was kind of intimidated, although it's always difficult interviewing an interviewer. I've actually known Andrew personally for many years. We've got close friends in common and we see each other semi-regularly. But when you know someone socially, you can't necessarily ask them all the questions you'd like to because that would be considered rude and nosy, even perhaps by Andrew Denton. But when you invite someone into a podcast studio for an interview, you can go for it. And I did. Andrew Denton is, in my opinion, the best interviewer in Australia. And long before I met him, I learned so much about how to interview people by watching him work. So much that has informed how I do my job in this studio and on this podcast. But even after watching him on TV for years, there are so many things about Andrew I didn't actually know before we sat down for this chat. Like the fact he's dealt with depression over the years, the ups and downs of his marriage to another of my role models, journalist Jennifer Byrne, and what exactly is going through his head when he's interviewing someone in front of an audience. Someone who maybe wants to be there, maybe doesn't want to be there, or maybe just gets up and walks out halfway through. So here's Andrew Denton, like you've never heard him before. Andrew Denton, how should I have prepared for this interview?
I would have suggested a solid meal, a couple of whiskies, a massage and a trip to Vanuatu. But that's how I prepare for all mine. What's your issue?
Last time I interviewed you, I needed a couple of stiff
I know
drinks
you did.
Because
so we were talking about voluntary assisted dying. We're not going to touch death today.
That was heavy.
I know. And I in fact, I read your comments afterwards and you said you'd found that so confronting. So
I did, not in the moment so much, more in the lead up.
Yeah.
I found that when we were talking it was really interesting.
Sure.
And afterwards it was really interesting too. But in the lead up I found the thought of it a bit much. I'm very much in the moment when we were talking.
Sure.
And how can that not be interesting? Do you want me to tell you how I did prepare for today?
How?
Not well enough. So I remembered this morning that you were coming. No,
I see.
I knew before, but I thought because we know each other quite well, I thought, oh, I know what. And then I thought this morning, oh no, I really should have prepared better. So I started madly cramming.
I'm guessing you had a huge dossier on Andrew Dado.
Yeah, he actually works here. He hosts one of our podcasts.
Oh, there you go.
So he could walk past at any moment.
Good.
I know Andrew Dado quite well, but no, what I did was madly cram, like for an exam.
Okay, so my genuine answer to your question is the best way to prepare for an interview, even if you are madly cramming, is to put all that to one side and think, what do I really want to know?
Yes.
I mean, what do I really want to ask?
You do have a team of producers.
Yes.
And I want to start by maybe breaking down one of your most recent interviews, which was with Andrew Anderson, to understand your process a little bit better.
Sure.
So you started that off with your intro saying to camera that there had been some conditions placed on the interview.
Hello and welcome to a new series of interview. We're beginning with a powerful and moving story of grief and resilience. Almost 6 months ago, 26-year-old Liam Anderson, the son of legendary Australian rocker Andrew Anderson, left a party in Sydney to look after an acquaintance who he could see was in a bad state. That man is now accused of Liam's murder a short time after in a public park. Over the last couple of months, my producers have been meeting with Angry regularly to work out how best to talk about this. And out of respect to Angry and his family and to protect them, we've agreed to certain rules in tonight's conversation. At Angry's request, we're not going to go into any of the details of what happened the night that Liam was killed. At Angry's request, we're not going to mention his son's name during the interview. At our request, Angry's going to be joined by his oldest child, his daughter Roxanne, who he describes as his rock. Angry and Roxanne have given us their trust, and tonight we're going to try and tread through what's happened to them as respectfully and carefully and gently as we can. Thanks for joining us. Let's go.
How does that work for a start? So I imagine you're pitched interviews all the time.
No, not all the time. It's a lot harder than it may appear to get people sitting in the chair. This came about in an unusual way in that one of our producers, his wife has worked with Angry in a whole other sphere of their lives, and they had a fairly strong personal connection. So first of all, through my producer's wife, we reached out and said, would you be interested in talking? And I said in the introduction that those conversations had gone on for a couple of months. They had. And I guess in a nutshell, the point of those conversations was not just would you come and talk, but there needs to be a reason for you to come and talk. And we know why we'd like to hear from you, but because you're so raw and so fragile, and not just Angry and not just his daughter Roxy, but the whole family. So there were two other members of the family that weren't in that interview, but they were part of our bigger conversation. And I guess the word we put back to Angry and Roxy was, what is the value in the interview? What is the value for you? What is the value for the audience? Come if you think there's value to it. Otherwise, don't come. So
there's got to be something in it for the person you're interviewing as well as for you. For the audience. You being the avatar for the audience, essentially.
The value for us in a naked sense, our job is to get an audience. So there's value for us in that respect. But if it's just that, if it's just trawling through somebody's grief to get an audience, then I don't think anyone feels very good about that. But first and foremost, it has to be about Angry and his family. And is there not just a reason, but as I said, a value in you doing this? Are you going to walk away from this with something that's going to help you rather than something that's going to make you feel worse about what's happening or is going to put you back into a place that you don't want to be?
Is that something that you've learned over time, that if people come and they don't feel that they are going to get anything out of it, that either the interview isn't good or they end up feeling resentful or bitter about it?
I worked very hard to avoid that situation. I remember many years ago when I was doing Enough Rope, Matthew Newton's people brought him round to talk about possibly doing an interview, and we talked, and I remember advising him not to.
That would have been a good get, as it said,
it would have been called. Because I just felt he wasn't he wasn't in a space to be talking, and that was a judgment. In the end, he's an adult. He makes his own calls, but I would have been uncomfortable about doing that interview because I felt he was not in good shape.
If he'd have said, no, I want to do it, what would you have done?
We certainly would have explored it further, but it's our prerogative to also say no. And so long ago now I can't remember, but I would have been. I think my initial instinct probably would have held.
I guess the line between those two things, Angry and Matt Newton, is a sense of responsibility that you have for the well-being of your guest, not just the entertainment of your audience, because I would have loved to see you interview Matthew Newton.
In the case of Matthew Newton too, and this also does change the equation, his actions impacted on other people in the public eye. And so there was that to consider. Because
there were charges of domestic violence against him.
All of that. So in the case of Angry, what's happened in his family has happened in his family. And so the big consideration for us, and this is why there was a lot of conversation with Angry and Roxanne over the couple of months leading up to the interview, was not just them, but the whole family, because they're all processing the grief of what's happened in different ways. So it was interesting when the interview went to air, and it never ceases to fascinate me how people. I've always said when you make a TV show, you make three. There's the one you plan to make, which is brilliant. There's the one you do make, which may not be brilliant. And then there's the one the audience sees, which can be entirely different to the other two. So one person wrote after the show that they were really upset that the interview had been censored and that they hated seeing an interview censored. And I thought, well, I guess I can understand how you've come up with the word censorship, but I thought we'd explain that we have a duty of care to look after the family. And so the reason we agreed to conditions to that interview, which is not what we normally do, is because there's grief here and we have to respect that process, and we have to respect the boundaries that somebody needs to put up so that they can deal with that grief. And what I didn't want, and what I don't think the audience would have wanted to see, but I didn't want it personally and I didn't want it professionally, was to see a broken man breaking down on television. We all know. You only have to look at his body language to see how much pain he's carrying. And that didn't need to be amplified in any way.
Do you approach every interview with a game plan in terms of, here's what I want to achieve, here are the 5 notes or 10 notes or the 2 notes that I want to touch on, here's roughly how I'm going to get from A to B to C to D?
Yeah, in fact, I approach every interview with a script. How I do it is get a great brief from my researchers, and out of that I'll just make notes and write questions. I'll then divide that into 5 or 6 or 7 areas, usually with some kind of semi-attempt at being a witty title. And then my producers all pile in with their questions. Then I'll write that into a script, which will be about somewhere between 20 and 25 questions, and we'll go backwards and forwards. So by the time I walk onto the set, I've memorised and internalised the script of questions. Now, that may seem like a strange way to do it, but there's a couple of things. One is language is so important in the kind of response you're going to get. You can say to somebody, why did you crash that car? And they're going to say, well, I crashed that car because I was drunk and I was being stupid. But if you say to somebody, what do you think it was that led you to put yourself in that danger, for example, that's an entirely different question. Language is very precise.
Yeah.
And I remember years ago interviewing Natalie Imbruglia, and it was clear that she'd had a period in her career in England where she went off the rails a bit. And I remember coming up with a wording for a question which was along the lines of, did you consider at any time flirting with drugs? Which is a way better way of putting that question rather than did you take drugs? Because it gives them space to move. It gives them space to say, I did consider it, or I did flirt, without necessarily going, yeah, I took drugs. Or, yes, there were reasons I might have gone there. So there is very precise language. But all of that, that's just a roadmap. And the best interviews, there's always things that people say that invite a follow-up question. And the best interviews sometimes go somewhere where you didn't expect it all. And I may have a roadmap, but the guest doesn't. So they may leap ahead to where I want to get to at the end of the interview. So I have to follow that, bring it back round and see where it goes. So it's a mixture of preparation and then let's see what happens.
A lot of improvisation.
Yeah, and my favourite times are when it goes off the map, in fact.
What's going on in your head during the interview?
When I'm really focused, which isn't always, we all have our bad weeks, I guess 3 things. First of all, there's the map. So I have my own, right, this is the question I'm going to next, here's the piece of information. I try and I am very anal about this. I try and really get the quotes right and the information right, and because that to me is a mark of respect. So there's the map. It's like there's a screen in my head. I can see my 2 pages of notes with the precise language. And
How long does it take you to memorise that?
It's one of my least favourite parts of the week. To get it to a point where it's just second nature, probably about 3 hours. It's like doing an exam. So there's that. If there's 3 screens in my head, obviously the main screen is the person that's sitting right in front of me. And I'm obviously listening to what they're saying, but I'm also trying to read their body language. And I'm reading the audience response as well, but particularly their body language. So that's the main screen. Then there's the second screen, which is my script. And then there's a third screen, which is like my inner voice, if you can have a voice on a screen, which is basically analysing everything that's happening in that moment and going, what, do I move on to the next question? Do I move on to the question at the end of the script? Did they say something else? Would a joke work here? Would that joke be good? No, I shouldn't say that. I think the audience is getting bored. I think they're losing their track. I don't think they've answered the question. Do I need to go back and find a different way? So it's all of that. It's just recalibrating the entire way.
What makes someone difficult to interview?
Well, I think the most obvious answer to that is somebody who's closed, who just can't find a way to be open. So, and in fairness, this was as much my fault as his, but Jeff Kennett was a great example of that. Jeff Kennett had wanted to come on to talk about Beyond Blue, which I was very keen to talk about. But I'd also met Jeff several times, and I'd seen him in private be an enormously entertaining and very funny, interesting man. And I also knew from a conversation I'd had with him privately, even though we didn't talk directly about him, that depression was an issue for him too. And so I wanted to talk about that.
Which he hasn't discussed before.
No, but I made the considerable error of starting the interview talking about his life and Felicity and so on. And in my mind, I was going to get to Beyond Blue towards the end, but his politicians and combative mind just read it as, right, they're not going to do what I want to do. So all the walls went up. So before the show, there he was, this charming, entertaining, witty Jeff Kennett, and the minute he walked onto the set, he became the opposite of those things and never got that conversation back on track. So when somebody just puts up all the walls, and politicians are the prime examples of this, that's mostly what they do all the time.
And they're so good at avoiding asking questions. They have taken some mystery masterclass on that.
They have, and the only politician ever really who other than the late Don Chipp, who was well out of politics by the time I spoke to him, who really broke those rules, and the two times I interviewed him was Mark Latham.
I have done about 300 of these interviews now, and you and Richard Feidler are very much my interview mentors and teachers. Probably everybody who's ever done an interview would say that to you. And I remember noticing from both you and Richard, neither of you have notes. And so I never have notes. Why is it that you don't have notes?
A few reasons. When I was in my teens, I saw one of the most extraordinarily horrible interviews I've ever seen. It was when I think John Howard must have been leader of the Liberal Party, and Andrew Peacock, who was a senior minister, there were all these rumours that he was going to challenge. And it was an interview, I think it was with ABC Perth, but it was broadcast nationally. And the interviewer had a list of questions. And obviously this isn't a verbatim recollection, but this is how I recall it. The interview went something like this. Question, Mr. Peacock, there's a lot of rumours that you're going to challenge Mr. Howard for the leadership. How much truth is there in those rumours? Andrew Peacock, well, I'm here to tell you tonight that I will be resigning my ministerial post tomorrow, and I will be calling for a spill in the party room. Question, you say that you have no ambitions for the leadership, and yet and this happened 3 times. And the third time he actually said, are you not listening to what I'm saying? I've just told you I'm going to challenge for the leadership. So that was a horrifying example to observe. So first of all, there's just nobody ever wants to get caught out like that. Secondly, it is courtesy and respect. I have quite literally taken the time to learn about you and your life. So I want an unencumbered interview. I was talking about body language before. And part of that unencumbrance is me being vulnerable too. I've got no weapons there. I've got no shield. I have no clipboard. I have none of those things. I'm open to what might happen. And sometimes I get stuff thrown back at me, and so I'm open to that. The third thing is, I think it sends a psychological message to the guest, which is, gosh, he seems to know a lot of stuff. I better not get caught out here. I better tell the truth. It doesn't mean they always do. So it's both a mark of respect and it's a mark of, it's a signal that, we've paid attention and you're worthy of this level of attention. And so please give.
On the subject of not getting caught out, I was thinking about how much the climate's changed since you first started doing Enough Rope, and now with Interview, social media has come along. And now two things have happened. Firstly, public figures don't rely on the media to tell their stories. They can tell their own stories by tweeting or by posting on Facebook. And secondly, the pylon. We've seen the pylon.
Yep.
And one thing that someone could say in an interview could be taken out of context, twisted and turned into a massive pylon, which means that people are much more fearful.
Absolutely. Look, the game has changed. So I think, how long a break was there? There was at least 10 years between the end of Enough Rope and the start of Interview last year on 7. And the game has changed exponentially. And both those things are true. It's a lot harder to get people on the show than it ever was, because a lot of people are managing their image through social media, and people are concerned about a long sit down for that very reason. So last year I spoke to Guy Pearce, man I've got a lot of warmth and respect for, very candid. And it was just a throwaway question, actually. I wasn't really searching for anything particular. But I asked him about working with Kevin Spacey, and he just threw out a remark, which is he was very handsy. And I asked him, I think, one little follow-up question. I didn't follow it up a lot because I could see he was very uncomfortable. And in fact, later in the interview, I wanted to talk to him about what his album was about, which is separating from his wife and very dark times he'd been through. So I didn't want him that uncomfortable at that point in the interview. And afterwards he said to me, I think I'm going to get into trouble for that comment. And I said, look, there wasn't much in it. I don't think so. Well, how wrong was I? Within 24 hours, it was in 200 papers around the world, and he was having to kind of explain himself and say, I regret having said it. So it's a very, very difficult time, and I don't in any way undervalue the honesty that people are prepared to show when they come on the show. And the risk. Although I've always said to people, and this is absolutely true, even if what you're showing is not a good thing, if you are genuinely prepared to be authentic and honest, the audience will register it, they will know it for sure, and they will judge you well for that.
But they're two different things, aren't they? There's the reaction of the people who watch the interview, both live and on the show, and then there's the people who read a grab on CNN or on Twitter that said Guy Pearce accuses
Kevin Spacey of
#MeToo or sexual assault, whatever it happens to be. And they're very different people. So in terms of the different screens that you have in your mind, do you also have a screen that's social media?
No, I don't. And
I mean, I'm glad you don't.
No,
but
I don't see any.
That's because you're not the one being interviewed.
That's true. I don't see any point in it. It varies. Like Lily Allen, for example, was just incredibly forthright. And look, Guy, one of the things I love about Guy is he's very candid. He's one of the few actors I know who say, that film I was in, it was shit and I was shit. And I really love that about Guy.
Yeah.
But no, I don't factor that in at all. And look, I do think...
Do you notice a wariness in your guests that you maybe didn't because of that?
I think those that come on are okay. I think they're ready to go. But I think it's the reason some don't come on, not because of something we're going to do, but because they can't control the space. But it is interesting, and you would see this. Podcasting is the other thing that has changed the landscape. And I know as somebody that's created a podcast and who loves podcasting, this is also a great space for long conversations. In some ways, it's the best space for long conversations because it's unguarded, unfiltered, one might even say.
And people don't. I do. I appreciate that. It's called No Filter, by the way. If you've done your research, you would know that.
I know, but you see, I wasn't doing a direct plug. I was doing an
more subtle than that.
Yeah, that's right. And now you've ruined what was a beautiful moment. Wow. No, I'm in my shell now.
Do you know the difference, though?
Yes.
Is that people don't hate listen to podcasts.
No.
And podcasts, because frustratingly for those of us who make them, but also this is a good thing, it's harder to share them. So you can't retweet something. A clip can't go around of, the moment that Guy Pearce said that on your show or said it in a printed interview. So I think that means that podcasts are a bit of a sacred space in the media environment.
Yes and no. I mean, I was very surprised last year when I came back into public square and I did some podcasts and very happily. And I was very surprised that a sentence would be taken from that podcast and beaten up into a news article saying, oh, that's how that works now. So I think it's a more sacred space, I would agree, in as much as it feels still almost like a rural community.
Yeah, it's safer, I should
podcasting
say.
compared to
Yeah.
the big city of broadcast media.
Yeah.
And yeah, so safer is probably the word, and it's a nicer space too. It's not set up to be divisive or to flame people. Not these kind of conversations, anyway.
When I first started doing No Filter, I did them filmed out in the office, and I only did that for a little while because I found that as soon as people know they're being filmed, they react in a different way. They're automatically more guarded.
Yeah, you're more self-conscious. You're
Yeah.
aware that it's a performance rather than necessarily being as close to yourself as you can be. That's why I've always thought radio is preferable to television and podcasting is preferable to radio. And it, I made that podcast series Better Off Dead, and in my entire career I've never made anything with greater impact. I have no idea how many people have listened to it. It could be 1,000. I really have no idea. It went to the top of the iTunes charts, which as far as I know could be 11 people and a dog. But I can tell you that the depth of impact and what it has meant in terms of response. And by response, I don't mean thumbs up, loved your podcast. I mean people putting boots on the ground and doing things. I've never seen anything like it. So to me, it may be the slightly hidden force in media, but not only is podcasting for mine the best storytelling in the media, but it is also, if done right or for the right reasons, I think capable of having the greatest impact.
Everyone, when they interview you, says, what's the best interview you've ever done? Or what's the worst interview you've ever done? Or what's the most interesting interview you've ever done? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ask you some different adjectives.
Excellent. The tallest interview I've ever done?
Yeah. What's the most surprising interview you've ever done? Or one of them. I'm not going to say most definitively.
Yeah, no, and that's good you've done that. But in fact, there is an answer to that. Rolf Harris. So this is long before Rolf Harris went to jail, Rolf Harris. So I went to interview iconic Rolf Harris, the one that many of us grew up with, this extraordinary, unique painter and singer who just cobbled together. The more research I did, the more I realised he was this amazing cultural bowerbird who just carved this one-man niche. So I went to interview that Rolf. And the Rolf I found was this dark Rolf who was full of self-loathing and self-laceration, in tears. I remember him telling a story of going to visit his mum in hospital as she was dying, and his mate was Harry Butler, and Harry waited outside as Rolf went to see his mum, and well, maybe Harry must have overheard the conversation, because as Rolf left, Harry grabbed him and said, "For God's sake, tell her you love her." And Rolf told the story, and he's weeping, and this was...
It's not Jake the Peg.
Well, none of this was... Yeah. Not only was there no indication of this anywhere in the research, but it was just out of the blue. And I remember driving away from that interview and saying to Anita, my producer, "I'm paid to do this for a living, and I have no idea what just happened there."
What's the most unsatisfying interview you've ever done?
Well, what do you term as satisfying?
Well, I guess where you walked away just going, ugh. I mean, you mentioned Jeff Kennett before, but it's really where...
That was disappointing.
You didn't get what you wanted out of it.
That's difficult to answer. I mean, it's not quite the same thing, but definitely one of the... probably the worst interview, or one of the worst interviews I ever did, which was unsatisfying because it was because I didn't ask the questions I actually, the advice I gave you at the start of the interview, what do you really want to know? I didn't do it. And it was with Princess Mary and Prince Frederick. And my issue was that I just find royalty just batshit boring. My eyes roll up back in my head. When it was suggested, we had this opportunity, everyone in the office was like, "This is amazing." You're always looking for, I think it was our first show for the year, you're always looking to make a splash. And I'm like, oh, God, really? And I took that whole attitude with me into the interview. And not surprisingly, it was a crap interview. I got shit-canned for it, quite rightly. And
what was the criticism?
Oh, well, that I looked sycophantic. I wasn't sycophantic and royalty meant zero to me. I just wasn't interested. And so the questions were facile.
So you phoned it in?
I phoned it in and I paid for it. And afterwards I thought, well, I know the first question I should have asked, which is, what's royalty for? That's a question I actually would like to hear the answer to, but I didn't. So it was deeply unsatisfying. I don't know what responses I would have got, but it was deeply unsatisfying in terms of how I went about it. And it was a great reminder, I was going to say lesson, it's not the first time I've learnt the lesson and possibly won't be the last, which is the minute you think you're on top of something, usually it's on top of you.
What's an interview where you've been really uncomfortable?
There was an interview I did after Enough Rope finished. I did a shorter series called Elders, which was premised on going to people over the age of 65 around the world to see what wisdom they had gleaned from their lives. And so it wasn't just their professional experience, it was the business of leading a life and all the things that involves, triumph and loss and so on. And I interviewed a remarkable woman, Helen Thomas, who is the doyen of the White House press corps. She would always get the first question from the president. She'd known every president from Roosevelt through to Clinton. Part of her life story is her husband had died, I think, of a degenerative illness, if I remember correctly, and she'd nursed him. And because normally in a studio you would have a monitor and up will come pictures, but I was in a hotel room, so I had a picture of her and her husband. I pulled it out, and she just angrily started crying. And she said, "This is what you came for, isn't it?" And I insisted it all stayed in the interview, actually, because it was such a raw moment. And it wasn't a moment to my advantage, certainly. And I thought, on one level, yes, it is, in that we wanted to talk to you about how you have navigated life.
Because that's the humanity. It's not just her job.
No, but she saw it as a deeply manipulative moment.
As a gotcha.
And in that moment, because of her response, it felt like a deeply manipulative moment. And it's all, if anyone's got the Elders DVD, remember DVDs? They were just after charcoal sketches. If anyone's got that, you can see that moment all in there, and you'll see me saying to her, "Look, I'm deeply sorry. Do you want to stop the interview?" We went out to dinner that night, which was very much to her credit, and she said, "Look, I'm sorry. That was as much about me as about you. This is just not where I'm comfortable." But I felt really terrible, and I thought, it still bugs me to this day that often I still hear that casual thing, "Oh, you're the person that makes people cry," to which there's a few reasons that bugs me. One, why would I want to be that person? You have no idea how uncomfortable it is when somebody starts crying. It's very, very difficult. You're dealing with an emotionally volatile moment in a public space for which I have some responsibility. So it's very hard, and I never enjoy that moment. Secondly, a show which was setting out to make people cry, I would not want to watch that show. But the third thing is, crying in and of itself is no bad thing. Why is crying any worse than laughter? These are both expressions of emotion. One is joy, one is pain. This is what we're after, is emotional truth. If crying is one of those emotional truths, then that's valid. And it feels to me there's a kind of a school ground immaturity to, "Oh, they cried." It's not, "Oh, they cried." It's like, thank you for being honest enough to share how you feel. That's what we're talking about, is how people feel.
In the interviews that I've done, I've found that the more famous a person is, the worse the interview is. You've been doing it a lot longer than me. I don't know if you see any correlation.
I have a different way of looking at it, which is the best interviewees are those who have been through their period of great fame and are now on the other side of it. And in rock and roll terms, I used to refer to it as they've gone through their up themselves period.
Yes.
So, this is slightly unfair because the circumstances were different. But I think the very second show I ever made for the ABC, the second episode of Blah, 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 we had a band on every week. It was a wonderful musical education for me, and it was Australian Crawl with James Rain. And, I was completely unknown. I'd hosted one show on television. So James was rehearsing, and I just rock up in my jeans and T-shirt, and I go up and introduce myself and say, "Hi, James, I'm Andrew. I'm the host of the show. we have a lot of fun here. Sometimes we fuck around. And he looked at me and said, you fuck around and I fuck off. And I thought, okay. And that was a particularly interesting thought because each show was about something. And I can't exactly remember what the show was about, but it must have been status or something like that. And just so I could ask one particular question, because I was going to interview him later, we had him sitting on a little red plastic chair, and I was sitting on a 30-foot high speaker's chair, replica speaker's chair, which had been made for some parliamentary series, just so I could ask him, do you sometimes feel you need props to make yourself feel more confident? So I thought, this is going to go very badly. Anyway, cut to however many years later, 15 years later, and I'm doing breakfast on Triple M, and we're doing a thing called the Musical Challenge, where we get musicians to come and sing something in the opposite of their style. And James comes in, and because James, if you remember with Australian Call, was legendarily difficult to understand what he was actually singing. So I asked him to sing Kate Bush's Wuthering Heights, which is also very difficult to understand.
Yep.
Anyway, he could not have been more chill and relaxed and gorgeous and
humble.
And what I saw in that
side.
was, and I get it, that when he was telling me, you fuck around with me and I fuck off, that wasn't because he's a horrible guy. That's because he's anxious. I'm hanging on here.
Okay, here's what I'm going to do.
Okay.
You ready?
Yeah.
I've gone against my rule of not having any notes or printouts.
You do
What
have
I've
notes here,
done
yes.
is
And I'm reading them
it's
upside
actually
down.
a printout.
I'm reading them upside down. And the answer to your first question is I'm Taurus.
It's a printout of questions that people ask about you on Google.
Oh.
Because I typed in Andrew Denton,
okay.
heart actually, because I was going to ask you about your operation. And then there's a little section that says people also ask.
Oh, okay.
So you ready?
Right.
Who is Andrew Denton's wife?
Jennifer Byrne.
How did you and Jen meet? That's my question. How did you and Jen meet?
Do you know this story?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, so it was at a rally to stop Kerry Packer taking over Fairfax, at which Jennifer was speaking. It was at the Opera House. And what was impressive about that is that Jennifer worked for Kerry Packer at the time. So that was a pretty ballsy thing to do. I knew none of this. I barely knew who Jennifer Byrne was. I knew her as a name of 60 Minutes, which I hardly ever watched. I worked at the ABC. I sat in the audience next to Patrick Cook. We made lots of acerbic remarks about all the speakers, including, no doubt, Jennifer. Anyway, afterwards, I'm standing there in my high-fashion shorts and runners. Jennifer came up and said, I like your show, which was blah, 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 which came as quite a surprise to me because I could have named the audience at that point. And I said, thanks, and I'm interested in this cause. Let me know if I can help. And she said, we're all going for a drink. Come and join us. So we went round the corner to the Rocks, and I found myself at what I now realise was the Illuminati of Australian journalism. I was this strange anachronism in this crowd. We're chatting away. Jennifer says something, and I make some offhand caustic remark about 60 Minutes, and she basically says, well, if you want to be like that, you can go. And I thought, okay. So I apologised. And anyway, we found ourselves in conversation maybe an hour later, and we were just talking, the two of us. And I don't know what the moment was, but there was a clear moment where the conversation stopped between us. But it wasn't that moment of awkwardness of what do we do now? We just held each other's gaze. And from that moment, it was clear that there was a connection. And what I didn't know, because I knew nothing about her, is that her husband, from whom she had separated only weeks earlier, was sitting about 10 feet away.
What happened after that? Did you go home together that night?
No. Jen was heading off to Adelaide for 60 Minutes, so I we agreed for her to call me a few nights later.
Before texting?
Before texting.
It was harder then.
Well, no, it was better because we spoke for 8 hours on the phone. We spoke until the sun came up, literally. And then the next night we spoke for 6 hours. And then she came back to Sydney and I went round to her place and we've been together ever since.
How old's your son?
How old is my son? 24.
How long after getting together did you have Connor?
Let's see, it would have been 6 years.
Have you flirted with mental health struggles?
So you use the word flirted. Oh, who's been going to school? No, I've had mental health struggles, and I've had mental health struggles like the vast majority of Australians.
What have they been?
I didn't flirt with them. I dated them for a while.
Did you consummate
we
relationship?
got to first base. Depression, absolutely. And when I was in my late teens, my family doctor, I've always had great family doctors, actually said depression to me, but there was no, so this would have been back in the late 70s, there was no real conversation around depression. There was no medication. It was just, the word meant nothing to me. There was no further conversation than that word at all. And so, in fact, shortly around the time Connor was born, I had started a new 2 nights a week live show at Channel 7. And I was only probably about 6 weeks into it. It was literally around the time Connor was born. And I had to step away. I was having, I was close to having a breakdown. And in the 2 weeks I was away, that's when Connor was born. And that was the first time I actually went and realised that I could and realised that I should go and get professional help. And that was the first time I was introduced to medication, which can actually give you, it doesn't solve your problem, it just gives you a ladder to climb out of the hole.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of other things you do. And that was the first time I began to understand what the triggers were and to work out ways to deal with that.
What are the triggers for you?
Stretching myself far too thin, getting exhausted. And then there are deeper things, and I think these apply to almost everybody. The most damaging conversation we ever have is the one we have with ourselves. And sometimes you're not even aware you're having it. And, people that have worked with me have often talked about this, that I think perfectionist is a blunt term. I don't actually agree with that, but I certainly I'm very self-critical, and I think self-critical can actually tip over into something which isn't constructive. So all those things. But my way of, to me, we're all on the tightrope of quote-unquote normality, and it's a miracle that more of us don't tip off.
Mental health is a spectrum.
Mental health is a spectrum. I'm struck by how many of my son's generation, and I suspect you're the same, are dealing with anxiety and serious anxiety.
Do you deal with anxiety or more it's depression for you?
It's more depression. I mean, there are things about which I can get anxious, but I've never felt like I need to go and seek help for anxiety.
Are you stabilised now with your depression?
Yeah, and have been for a long time. But every now and then it just hits, and then I go back and go, oh, yeah, okay.
What do you
do?
It's
the same pattern.
Do you take a look around and go, okay, here's what I need to change?
Yeah, and normally I'll take some medication again just to climb out. It doesn't. I mean, it used to be quite debilitating for me. As I said, I nearly fell apart. But but when it hits, it can be like a physical feeling. It's like a chemical wash, and when it hits badly, and it's very rarely, I'm pleased to say, literally getting up out of the chair and walking across the room feels like an enormous effort.
Back to Google.
Mm-hmm.
Are Andrew Denton and Jennifer Byrne still married?
Yes, we are.
You said it's been 20.
Well, no, we got married. We got married 15 years ago, but we've been together almost 30.
How's marriage?
It's good. It's good, and
it's hard marriage.
It is.
I think
Absolutely, you've got to work at it.
A long-term marriage is really hard. Like you've been with her. You've been together
30 years,
pretty much more than half your lives.
Mm.
I've been the same with my partner. It's hard, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think accepting that it's hard and acknowledging that it's hard is important.
Did you know it was going to be hard going in?
Well, you don't think about that, do you? Because if you think, this is going to be hard, you're probably not going to get married, are you?
But you think about that about other things. You think about that about work. You think about that about exercise. You know other things are going to be hard but ultimately rewarding. But there's something about the hardness of marriage which can come as a surprise.
Yeah, but you're getting married. Getting married is not the same as taking a job or doing exercise. They're for specific outcomes. Whereas getting married is actually, who am I going to spend my time with? Who am I going to spend my time with when I'm old? Who am I going to share my soul with? And so they're not things that you can put an outcome on, that you can measure. A job, you can measure, have I succeeded? You can measure, what have I earned? With exercise, you can measure, what do I lift or how fast can I run? You can't do that with a marriage. The fact that it's work is important. because if it stops being work, I mean, it doesn't mean it's always work, but if it stops being work, if you stop thinking of the need to do work, then I think you become inattentive. And if you become inattentive, then I think ultimately you're either trapped in a marriage neither of you should be in, or you don't have a marriage.
When you got sick last year, which is the next question, what is Andrew Denton's illness? What is Andrew Denton's illness? Well,
alopecia.
Take your pick. Male pattern baldness.
That's so unnecessarily accurate.
Last year you were diagnosed with...
No, it wasn't last year.
The year before?
Yeah, see? This is what happens. This is what happens when you cram.
Andrew
Daddo was sick last year.
It just feels like it was last year. You got sick. You
How little
were
you
diagnosed
care. You
with...
pretend to be my friend. And
That's not true. I texted you. I cared very much.
You know when you lost your leg? No, I didn't, Mia.
I think I texted you.
I've got both my legs.
Fingers crossed before the operation.
You did. It was one of the most powerful emojis I've ever received.
I cared deeply.
That's right.
How did that happen?
Presumably you just chose that emoji and sent it to me.
And you were lying in a hospital bed at the time, about to go in for...
It meant everything to me.
Quadruple bypass surgery?
No.
Triple?
Quintuple.
Quintuple?
Yeah. Apparently.
High achiever.
Oh, absolutely. Of course.
You'd been not coincidentally, deeply immersed in talking to people in the end stages of their life through your work with Go Gentle.
Go Gentle, very good.
Now I'm scared. All my research is, I'm like doubting everything about my research. Go Gentle and becoming a euthanasia advocate because of what you saw your own father, Kit, go through. Was that a bit surreal, suddenly finding yourself staring down the barrel of a pretty life-threatening situation?
Being a dead person? Well, no. I mean, I remember going on Charlie Pickering's show to talk about that and describing myself as a prominent future dead person. We're all future dead people.
We are.
No, what was surreal was actually finding myself not just in the hospital system, but in the Catholic hospital system, because a lot of the opposition, in fact, the majority of the opposition comes within the Catholic health system. There was a funny part of that, which is they ask you endlessly, do you have any allergies? And I have an allergy to one medication called Keflex.
So do I.
There you go. So they said, do you have any allergies?
What happens to you when you have it?
I got medically induced hepatitis. That's what I got.
I get like hives all over me, but for days.
You've never been more attractive.
That's great.
So they said, do you have any allergies? I said, yes, Keflex. And then I thought, oh, God, I hope they didn't think I just said Catholics. But the other thing was, they were brilliant. It was St Vincent's here in Sydney. They were brilliant. And it was a reminder to me of a couple of things. First of all, what a great medical system we have. But secondly, and this was relevant to the stuff I've been campaigning about, it's very hard to be in hospital. Even if someone like me, though it was a fairly significant piece of surgery, I knew I never had a moment's depression or anxiety, to be perfectly honest. I knew I was in great shape and that I'd been very lucky. But to be there when you're at the end of life and really suffering and being offered no meaningful way out, that would be horrendous. So it brought home to me even more what it must be like to be in that situation.
2 final questions. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
They're not hard. Oh, one is from Google.
Yes.
Is Terry Denton related to Andrew Denton?
Absolutely, yes.
Really? Terry Denton being the
No, I'm just saying that
Treehouse.
because I just want to fuck up Google, so there we go.
That would have been a great scoop.
Yeah. You know, here's something that...
He's made a lot of money from those books.
He's very, very good.
Yes.
I went to visit some friends recently who have little kids, and they were so excited because my friends had told them the fib that I was related to Terry Denton. So I had to...
Rock star.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, he's a great guy.
And I wanted to ask about interviewing someone can be quite an intimate thing.
Mm-hmm.
Have you become friends? Sometimes people can feel that you're their friend at the end of the interview, and sometimes you do just spark a genuine connection with people.
Yeah.
Have you maintained relationships with people that you've interviewed?
Yeah, some. And some for a long time. When I was...
Who?
Very early in my career at the ABC, I interviewed Ben Elton on then Double J, and we just hit it off immediately and have been friends ever since. Interestingly, partly through Jen, but also just in the way it's gone, I've become friends with Rachel Ward, who was the first time on Enough Rope someone did burst into tears, and a moment which caught us completely by surprise, both of us.
What did you ask her?
I couldn't have asked her a simpler question. I can tell you exactly what it was. It was just, why Brian?
Oh.
But there'd been a whole lot of context, and what I didn't realise is what that context had meant to her. So, and she burst into tears. So there are others. And it's nice. But because it's such a – obviously we try and make it honest, but it's still a false construct. You know, it's how did Michael Parkinson describe it? Something like an unnatural act in a public place. I often really enjoy who I'm talking to. I'm often amused because an ongoing criticism is, he's so sycophantic in his interviews. And I think, well, if you see two musicians on stage really enjoying their musicianship, you don't think, gee, that guitarist is sycophantic towards the other.
That's a weird thing to say.
No, I actually am genuinely enjoying who I'm talking to. And
also, you're not Lee Sales. Like, you're not there to prosecute a particular argument.
No, very rarely. So, yeah, you want it to be an enjoyable experience. So there are others. I mean, then I recently had the experience, he'll be coming up in the next few weeks, of interviewing of someone I consider a friend, which is strange, and that's Stephen Curry. Beautiful Stephen Curry. And I was sitting there thinking, it felt very strange for the first 10 or 15 minutes. And then I was just sitting there thinking, my God, why hasn't anyone done a long interview with Stephen before? He can do everything. He's fantastic.
What's your process for after an interview?
I don't do a lot of debriefing with guests unless they really want to. I'm usually pretty wrung out by the end of an interview, so I'd like to get out of there, getting makeup off that's such a big moment for me. Like, let it go. There's a lot of nervous energy. And the next day, as a group, we'll go through the interview and what worked and what didn't work. If I haven't done an interview well, and there was one recently, and I'm not going to say who it is, but when you see it go to air, you may spot it. I was very unfocused because of a whole bunch of other things happening. Then I will replay that a lot, probably till the day I die. Not really, but yeah, I'll replay that a lot, and that's, you know...
The self-critic comes out?
Well, there's a reason for that self-critic. That was actually, you know when you haven't done something well, and I can feel it. I said at the start that there's a lot of focus in those three screens, and it doesn't happen very often, fortunately, but when it does, it's horrible. It's when some of the screens get static, when I can feel the focus going, because there's other stuff happening. It's both unprofessional and it's a horrible experience.
Yeah, I know how that feels. Have you ever had an interview afterwards that you regretted?
No, I mean...
I should be more specific. Do you regret giving someone a platform in hindsight?
No, I don't believe so. I remember interviewing Pauline Hanson on the ABC, and to me, it was really important to have people like her on the show, people that the broad assumption is that the ABC doesn't or won't or shouldn't be speaking to people like Pauline Hanson. My view on the ABC is that it's a hugely important cultural institution, and that its core task is not to speak to any one group of people but to show different ways of thinking.
Yeah, but there's a real pushback against that now, isn't there?
I know, and I know.
There's the idea of no platforming. It's like, well, if you don't completely agree with this person, you shouldn't give them a platform to speak.
When Sarah Ferguson interviewed Steve Bannon last year, and I saw some journalists within the ABC had objected, had I been the head of ABC News and Current Affairs, I would have gathered everyone in a room and said, this is what we're here for. We have a sacred public duty to show different ways of thinking, and if you are not on board with that mission, then you can resign. And personally, I think the leadership of the ABC has gone missing in this regard. I think there's some serious questions need to be asked within the ABC about the rise of that attitude. It is not the ABC's...
It's not just on the ABC, I don't think. I think it's on the left. I think it's on the left more broadly.
I think it's on the left more broadly, but I'm talking specifically about the ABC because the ABC is so important to our capacity to function intelligently as a country. And I remember when we were when I was seeking people to work on enough rope, and I was interviewing a whole lot of researchers. And I remember a particular person who was a long-time ABC staffer, and I'd asked everybody to bring a list of guests, and this list was the guest of every guest you would expect to be on the ABC you could imagine. And I kept it stuck up on the notice board to remind me of where I didn't want to be. So I think our third show, our guest was John Elliott. And it was so important to have John Elliott on the show. It's one of the reasons, one of my things I'm most proud of at the ABC was the fact that Russell Howcroft, who is an unabashed champion of capitalism, is now one of the most loved voices on the ABC. Not because I necessarily am an unabashed champion of capitalism myself, but it's so important that we allow these voices to be heard. How did I get around to that
people
point?
you regret giving platforms to?
So Pauline Hanson. And there was a lot of, how dare you speak to this woman? I was like, of course you need to speak to this woman. You need to understand, we don't need to, but it's helpful to understand that her mum was terrified of the yellow peril. You know, that her views of the world didn't come out of a clear blue sky. But, for example, because we're now in a different time, I was asked recently, would you have someone like Fraser Anning on? I thought about that, and here's where I'm at, and this is probably more indicative of where I'm at in my life and career, but also in how I'm reading the Times, is in that I could have Fraser Anning on and it would be clickbait and it would make noise and and I would certainly relish the task of a really carefully constructed interview that challenged his actions and questioned his actions and his thinking. However, I believe we are in such a dark and divisive time that to amplify somebody who is clearly, as far as I can see, speaking to our darker angels is not something I want to be part of.
Good.
Thank you.
Am I going to regret this interview?
You may. I think you did some time ago. I mean, you've had to turn to Google for your questions.
I
for
have.
God's
That's
sake.
how badly prepared
You should have
I
stared
was.
out that window a lot longer.
Thank you for listening to this episode of No Filter. Andrew Denton's interview TV show airs Tuesdays at 9 p.m. on 7, and you can catch up on 7+. After we finished the interview, I asked Andrew if he'd come and speak to the Mamma Mia team and do a bit of an impromptu Q&A, because he has so many fans and he's got so much wisdom and experience in the industry. And our team, particularly our editorial team, wanted to ask him some questions. So one of the ones that he was asked was about his interview, if he'd ever done an interview that had gone off the rails. And I actually meant to ask that in this episode. But he said that he once interviewed Richard E. Grant, the actor, and he's in a movie called With Nail and I and a bunch of other things. And he's an English actor. And he said what was interesting is that Richard just turned the interview on its head and started interviewing Andrew. And he'd done his research. So he knew things, for example, like the fact that Andrew and Jennifer, his wife, had separated for a while. And he asked him questions like, so when you and your wife split up, did you bonk other people? And this was all in front of an audience and the cameras were rolling. And Andrew said, the answer was no, by the way. Andrew said he actually really loved it because his background is in theatre sports. And so that idea of having to react in the moment and perform was really exciting to him. So I didn't think of doing that. I didn't think of asking him that question. At least someone else did for me. If you're looking for something else to listen to, I mentioned Richard Fidler, who is the other absolute icon of the interview. I interviewed Richard Fidler a little while ago on this podcast, and he approaches interviewing celebrities and real people in a really different way to Andrew, but his insights were equally just fascinating. So I'll put a link in the show notes, and you might want to go back and listen to that. This episode, like all episodes of No Filter, was produced by Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Freedman, and I'll see you on Mamma Mia, where we make the world a better place for women and girls. Tell me if any of these things sound familiar. Maybe you're working in a 9-to-5 job, or maybe the hours are longer than that, and you just feel like something needs to change. You might be working for someone else in a job that you don't like or that doesn't give you the time or the flexibility you really need for all of the other things you've got going on in your life, your family, your health, your passions. Or maybe you have a passion and everywhere you see other people turning their passions into businesses that give them money and the lifestyle that they've always wanted. But you have no clue whether you're even onto the right idea, let alone how to make money. I'm Mia Freedman and I'm the founder of Lady Startup, which is our platform here at the Mamma Mia Women's Media Company that helps women start and grow their own businesses. We have a podcast, we have a book, we have a store where you can buy Lady Startup products, and we have a course for everyone who wants to become a Lady Startup.
So my name is Katie Rockcliffe. I started this course because I'm a new business owner. I'm yet to launch. I wanted to learn a million things from Mia Freedman, who I knew full well could teach them to me. And I was very excited at that prospect, and her course has fully delivered.
It's a 6-week online course taken by me. There's videos and there's written material, and you can do it in your own time, around your own life. It's not like you've got to give up your day job. And it's designed to take you all the way from your idea, or even if you don't have an idea, we'll help you find one, to launch. Now, you don't have to actually launch your business in 6 weeks, but many, many people do. There's been over 1,000 women who've gone through the course and launched their own businesses. And what it does is that it gives you all the tools, the tips, the hacks, the inside insights, and the hand-holding that you need to go through all of those levels, because it can feel really overwhelming, really insurmountable. But what I've done, because I know how that feels, is I've broken it down into very bite-sized, doable chunks that you can do over the course of 6 weeks. And it will take you through everything from designing a logo, where you have to register business names, how to build your own website on the cheap, everything that you need to know about marketing, about social media, about the infrastructure that you need. And along with all the information that I give you and all the hand-holding, there's also a Facebook group that gives you a community of other women who are going through exactly the same thing. Because one of the loneliest parts of starting your own business is that you are doing it by yourself. And I didn't want anyone to have to experience what I did in the early years of starting Mamma Mia, because what I really missed was that tribe of other women. I might have been starting my own business, but I still wanted other women to bounce ideas off and people to, support me and cheer me up and give me some guidance and advice and be my in-house, not just cheer squad, but market research team as well. And that's what we make sure that we provide in the Lady Startup Activation Plan. We provide that community along with all the information that you need. But enrollments are only open for a few days. I limit the number of students that I work with because I want to make sure that I can be really focused on the students that I have. And so go to ladystartup.com.au and I'd love you to join me.